Hello. For the inaugural episode of the podcast, I'm inviting my good friend, Arjun Ramani. I'm excited to have him on. We've known each other since freshman year of Stanford when we got into a late night dorm argument about critical theory in high school debate, which I think says a lot about our friendship. Arjun is currently a PhD candidate in economics at MIT. And for the last 3 years, he's been a correspondent for The Economist, covering topics like finance, AI, and India. Welcome, Arjun.
Thanks, Jasmine. I think that I remember that conversation because I think everyone else in that room was talking about like CS 106 or something, and then we sort of just checked out because it's like we don't want to talk about classes. And yeah, that was great. And I feel like you've changed a lot since then. Um, you know,
This very ominous statement.
no, you're still very academic, intellectual, but also much more pragmatic, I think.
Interesting.
I
Okay.
subtweet at critiques in high school debate.
I mean, I literally just quit my product job to be a poster, so I'm not sure if that's true. But speaking of people who have changed a lot, what do you think of Mark Zuckerberg's new look?
Oh man, I'm sort of trying to figure out my own style. So maybe, yeah, I don't know. I kind of respect him for the mid-career shift. It sort of fits into the broader question with Zuck of whether it's performative for recruiting. He had a bad image problem after all the 2016 stuff, but and also currying favor with Trump, or is it just his true self is coming out and he was always like this and he just felt stifled by being super young CEO and the woke mob because we have him. So I don't know. Yeah, what do you think?
I think as much as I don't want to say so, I think it does look good. I think it is a response to like shifts in wokeness, but also fits him
Yeah,
better.
it's not working. So
Yeah, it's like kind of
for him.
working. And like, I think I default respect people who figure out their shit. So, it's better than the like gray t-shirt robot thing that was going on before. So, I'm happy for him. Cool. Okay, let's get into it. A couple of days ago, you texted me this new essay that PG just dropped, called Graham, The Origins of Wokeness. He starts by defining this old word, prig, which I thought was very funny. He defines it as a self-righteously moralistic person who behaves as if superior to others. And he's basically trying to say, like, actually, wokeness is not a new phenomenon. There have always been prigs in society who want to impose these rules upon others. I'm curious what you thought of the essay.
So I really like Paul. Big fan of his writing in general. I think this essay was more mixed. So I agree with the historical claims. Wokeness, it's not new. He makes the point, comes and goes in cycles. I thought the historical idea that young people, when they develop their ideologies, they're impressionable, when they eventually come into positions of power, that sort of is what drives shifts in elite cultural opinion. But it's possible to overstate the wokelash. In some ways, there are some shifts that probably will persist, like society's tolerant for, sex behavior, discriminatory behavior in firms. Whereas in other ways, things are sort of shifting backwards, like on police or immigration. But he makes this point that we can treat wokeness like a religion, and
Yeah.
that's like a solution to it. That didn't land with me because it's just a debate over what is within the morally acceptable kind of boundaries of discourse, and that's going to shift. And that's slightly different than religion.
Could you say more about like that distinction? Like, is it more that religions have like specific texts that they hew to, and like whereas wokeness simply is definitionally like constantly shifting and what the bounds are, or like, yeah, because if there was a new intervention posed by this essay, which I was sort of like, can we move past the wokeness debate now? But I did think that the religion thing was like the thing that surprised me a bit, and so yeah, I'm like curious why you feel that they're quite different.
Yeah, I mean, you could argue that, there are ideas from religions that constantly become mainstream, like a lot of modern American culture is, downstream of Christianity and so forth. But Indian culture, super influenced writ large by Hinduism. But what I was trying to say is that the boundaries of discourse, what's considered correct, it should always change in a way. There's always going to be this negotiation and evolution. Whereas with religion, we sort of agreed with a liberal society that like you're not supposed to try to convince other people of your religion. Whereas it sort of is fine to try to have try to make progress philosophically or morally through discourse, through movements. through political arguments and so forth.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. The other thing that was sort of interesting to me about the essay is just like the meta fact of why did PG choose to write and publish this in 2025? Like, to me,
Yeah.
I'm like, peak woke is clearly over. Like, Trump is in office. Like, you guys won. We've been having these conversations for many years now. And yet it seems to me like I've been constantly surprised by how many like tech luminaries, business leaders are
Yeah.
really, really, really focused on wokeness,
I'm
like way
just
more than I
one
would think that
particular.
they are. And it's not just like the tech right or whatever, right? Like PG is not a right winger. He was like very loudly like, guys, vote for Kamala. He broke with a lot of his peers over Israel Palestine. Like I would not characterize PG as part of the tech right. And so like, why do you think that he or others are still so concerned with this?
Yeah, it's a good question. So funny story, actually, I think this is July 2022. The Economist ran a cover story titled Peak Progressives, basically trying to make this argument that we'd passed peak woke. And I actually interviewed PG for a story that we could talk about right after that. And we talked about this for a really long time, and he was super fixated on the idea. And I think he actually tweeted about that later. So it's not a new idea for him, I think. But I think you can basically view the recent discourse as him and other kind of tech elites wanting to sort of process and rationalize the new political order publicly so they can sort of explain and defend their own place in it. So someone like him who's sort of threading the needle, hey, I'm anti-woke, but I still voted for Kamala, why that's justified, why it makes sense given the shift in norms. Why do you think?
Oh man. I mean, actually, there is like potentially a game that's going on where after being flamed for being a Kamala supporter, maybe he wants to show peers that he's still on the right side, i.e. like the anti-woke side. And it's like some sort of signaling thing of like, I am an independent, like I can be a centrist. And like, just because I supported Kamala doesn't mean I am no longer critical of like wokeness as a movement. But I don't know. He's also just an essayist. So sometimes you just need a good topic.
Yeah.
Okay, I actually do want to talk about the sort of material versus cultural debate, because I've been thinking, writing, talking to people a lot about like, what is the tech right? Where did it come from? Why is it happening? There have been lots of good posts about this. Like Tyler Cowen did like a big vibe shift post that was quite good. I feel like there's two big buckets of theories for the rise of the tech right. I would say like one is the material bucket, which is like, the end of zero interest meant that VCs were interested in like defense and government contracts. Or Biden and Lena Khan were like really hostile to big tech, and that turned them all off. Or one that's sort of popular among the left is literally just like, these are billionaires. Billionaires want lower taxes. Of course they are Republicans. But then there's also like this cultural explanation, which is more related to the wokeness stuff. Like actually there's something about wokeness that was like uniquely radicalizing for tech folks. It's like workers at companies, because of wokeness, were asking for these things that impeded productivity and were like annoying to the CEOs. Or journalists were like really mean to tech people and like constantly told negative stories about tech billionaires, even when they were doing like reasonable things like Zuckerberg constructing a hospital. Or like content moderation went way overboard. And this is sort of more of like, the backlash is more cultural to this, like everyone is being mean to us, rather than a purely like economic rational self-interest thing. And so I guess I'm curious for you, like, do you think that material or cultural concerns were a bigger factor in the quote unquote rise of the tech right?
I'm going to give the classic economist non-answer. I think they're both true, and it's hard to separate because they're sort of perfectly correlated. So the Lena Khan kind of neo-Brandeisian argument is that big market concentration is bad, partly because of its social and cultural effects. And on the tech side, being pro-progress is about letting companies grow, letting it rip, which makes money, but it's also about this kind of vision, this aesthetic of pursuing growth for its own sake, which is good, which is kind of a cultural and values argument. That's, Mark Andreessen's a recent super long essay on, why AI safety is bad, basically. That said, I do think a big chunk of the recent post-election stuff is very materialistic. Just consider, the counterfactual. If Kamala hadn't won or had won, would Zuck be doing what he's doing right now? Obviously not. It really reminds me of when I was in India and looking at how CEOs basically treated the Prime Minister Narendra Modi. When you have strongman rulers, supposedly independent CEOs, sort of they line up like courtiers to suck up to the ruler so they can, curry their favor. And now we're going to see, a bunch of protectionism with tariffs and so forth. And you're going to see everyone asking for exemptions, why their industry is strategic, why they are a good guy. I'm very curious to see what happens with this whole TikTok thing. But one argument I heard, which I have no idea if this is true, is part of the reason why Zuck is doing so much right now is because he wants to buy TikTok, and he's also looking for what you could call air covers. So like anything that Elon does is sort of, he's the first buddy. It's all good to go, right? So you can't tell me what I'm doing is wrong if I'm just doing the same thing Elon is, right? So like, put in community notes and go to the inauguration and all that stuff. The last thing that comes to mind on this is a point you've made to me many times, which is you have to distinguish the sort of capitalist and labor class in tech. And donations from executives, I think, massively shifted this last political cycle from vast majority being blue to the majority actually being red. But like if you were to take a sample of workers in the tech industry, I would guess the shift would be much less. Like SF County, it wasn't that much more in favor of Trump than before. So I think it's that would point to it being more of a material thing. That said, if intensity of preference among the kind of working class went down, where they're less likely to boycott or change decisions in which firms they go to, which I think is true, then that's why the kind of power in this market shifts more towards the investors and founders and so forth.
Yeah, that's a good point. I am sort of like curious to dig more into the worker level shifts. Like, obviously, this is a biased and imperfect microcosm, but so we were both at Stanford during peak techlash. There's a lot of like no tech for ice stuff going on, which, disclosure, I was like somewhat involved with. And then these days, you have a lot of energy around like Stanford defense clubs, and actually working for Anduril and Palantir is awesome again, and we should all be hacking for defense. And so, yeah, I am sort of curious. I'm thinking of doing a reporting project where I just go down to campus and talk to a bunch of like younger folks about like what their own political shifts are, like what kinds of companies that they are interested in. And maybe this is like more unique to Stanford than sort of like tech workers writ large. But because these tech leaders are quite public about their beliefs and their opinions, like they're publishing blog posts, they're tweeting all day, it does have like quite a bit of influence on like what especially like younger and aspiring tech workers like also believe and choose to do, like partly because they just like respect these folks and like look up to them and like want to believe the similar things, and also because I think there is a thing where these days like you don't want to come off as contrarian to the tech leaders, say like to be like really woke or whatever, because are you going to be able to raise capital or something if you do that? And so there's always a dynamic there.
Yeah, that's a really good point. I think the usage of blog posts to create a worldview, convince people you're cool, is maybe one of the biggest ways in which, or Twitter really also to do this, it's one of the biggest ways modern tech is different than past industries which have always had you want to recruit and you want to convince regulators of your worldview, but you didn't have direct access to people like you do now.
Yeah. Lulu Messervy, who's, I think she currently runs her own comms firm, but we know each other from when she was head of comms at Substack. And her whole thing is like going direct. Like founders should tweet and do Substack and not try to mediate their visions through the mainstream media, which like is often quite negative on tech, probably to an extreme extent. So I get that.
Do you know what happened to the American Dynamism Club? Wasn't there some club that was trying to have like some party with A16Z, and then they didn't get approved, so they did it off campus. Did they ever get approved?
I have no idea, but that is such a good I'll go find out. Yeah, because I have been just seeing more energy around American dynamism and defense tech and that kind of thing from younger folks.
It's funny because like Steve Blank, he's one of the startup guys at Stanford, teaches the Lean Launchpad class. He's like super in that world. There are multiple people who are very into that world.
I mean, we've had hacking for defense with Condi Rice like forever. It was just like kind of uncool for like the period that we were in school.
Yeah. No, that was a very unusual period. It was all like tech ethics. I remember like the number of classes that were really, And I wonder how much that sticks.
Yeah, I don't know. It's interesting. Yeah, my overall thought on the sort of like cultural versus material debate is like I still see myself in the like left liberal camp, and like that world really underrates the cultural stuff. Like I think you're right that obviously like considering the counterfactual, like would Zuckerberg be being like, oh, Meta is too feminine now if like Kamala won? Like obviously no, he would not be doing that. But at the same time, like when I, for example, read PG's essay, I was like, oh, this is a complaint about like bureaucracy as much as it's a complaint about politics. It's more of this like cultural thing of like builders in, prigs out. And there are all of these memes that there have been for quite a while, like high agency or founder mode or like live players or you can just do things. My friend Clara, who edits Asterisk magazine, was telling me about a concept she heard at some conference where someone was like, yeah, this is like Robert Moses libertarianism.
Well,
What does that even mean? And I think like, you know, what it really comes down to is like, this is incoherent, except for like Moses was really going founder mode. Like he was a really high agency guy. He's very effective, right? And like there is some like disposition where tech, because it is, you know, the industry of like innovators and disruptors, is just like anybody who's like super effective and hacks a system, whether it's from the inside or the outside, whether it's in like tech or in politics, they sort of like get that respect. Then that relates to why I see progress as like the primary coalition rather than like left or right, or it's like I think Lonsdale calls it like the builder class or something. Like there is economic self-interest, obviously, but it's also an aesthetic preference.
to an extent, you could reductively frame it as good is good, right? But, you know, I do think what you said about bureaucracy and procedure is the difference, right? So should you just follow what you think is good and ignore sort of the rules of the game, and, you know, ignore the prigs, or not?
Yeah, actually, one funny thing here that I was thinking about is I was recalling this conversation with my friend Matthew earlier, but during the pandemic, I want to say in like 2020, I was doing all these like virtual book clubs with my friends, and the first couple of books I chose were sort of like racial justice books because again, it was like post 2020 protests. So I think we did like Just Mercy by Brian Stevenson, and then the second one was the autobiography of Malcolm X.
Yeah, I remember that one.
And yeah, that one was so funny because the majority of my friends who wanted to read it, we read it because we were interested in the racial justice stuff. And then our friend Felix also joined the book club. And we were going around and all saying like, oh, like I'm interested because I want to learn about Black power, or, like racial justice or like movement building or whatever. And Felix was like, oh, I just wanted to read it because Malcolm X is a great man. It's so funny because it is true that there are so many tech folks who really like the autobiography of Malcolm X. Like,
Yeah,
sort of also similarly, like they don't care about his. I mean, not they don't care, but like I don't think it's about his politics. It's not like they're like super like Black power heads. They're just like, yeah, that guy, great man.
or Robert Moses, got to read him because he's, you know, the great man of government.
I mean, have
Yeah.
you read The Power Broker?
I read like half of it.
Okay.
I should finish it. The book is not super flattering about him, but I think you can read it and still get a flattering impression of him because he got so much stuff done.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That was how I felt about the Malcolm X autobiography too. Like I think that for those of us who came to it because we were interested in racial justice, came away with a worse impression of Malcolm X because he was, for example, like a real womanizer. Like then, like, you know, my impression's still positive, but like it really moderated it out and made him look like a more complex character. Whereas I think like if you come into that book with like a great man reading, then he's a badass. Like he was talking about how it's one of his favorite books because there's like this like line where he loads up a gun with a bunch of blanks, but then he like doesn't tell anybody, like goes around to his friends and allies and like plays Russian roulette and then at the end like points it at his own head and fires it too. And it's just like, is that not the most like badass shit in the world? I'm like, yeah, I guess it is.
And I think you made a point in one of your recent Substack posts, but that kind of shift to the, you know, the focus on progress is not really split along traditional party lines. I mean, you could even say that the Biden administration kind of agrees with builders and prigs out, right? Like Biden didn't want advice from academics compared to Obama. Like you know, the people at the top of administration were, you know, operators, lawyers, people, as opposed to academics. And you know, the whole reindustrialization of America, you know, passing these massive spending packages, the whole moniker of supply side progressivism, NEPA, basically like lots of people at the top of the administration would agree with the claim that regulation is preventing them from achieving their goals. Yeah, I guess how much of it is the tech ideology driving things versus sort of a natural reaction to you know, the fact that we are facing inflation and we're in this new Cold War with China and so forth is sort of difficult to disentangle.
Yeah. You mentioned that there are like historical analogs in like recent US history that you feel are relevant, right?
Oh yeah, yes. I just think 70s and 80s is the classic analog for the great inflation, where you had big supply shock to energy markets, OPEC 1973, and then you had inflation, and then in response to that, you got a bunch of deregulation, both from Carter and then from Reagan and tax cuts, and because the body politic that was annoyed that their living standards fell, and so that's what politics does, is you get the kind of natural reaction to that. And so if we didn't have a kind of tech-driven progress studies coalition today, would we be still having the same response? And I think probably yes. It would probably be flavored differently, but there would probably be something roughly in that direction.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's a good point. I think you're probably right that like there are these macro factors that would have shifted policy and the discourse in this direction either way. So one of the reasons that I wanted to bring you in particular in to talk about this stuff is that you did get to spend a bunch of time with Paul Graham, Sam Altman, Patrick Collison, and Joe Lonsdale for an Economist piece that you did about a year ago on the new tech worldview, which we'll link in the notes, of course. It was a fun piece. It was interesting. Like we learned, for example, that Sam is a wash jeans guy and Joe is a linen guy. Extremely good intel. I wanted to hear more about that piece. Like, why did you pick those four individuals to talk to? Do you think that they are meant to represent four distinct worldviews or like one unified tech worldview, as the headline implies? I'm just sort of curious how you came to that article.
Yeah. So it was actually 2 years ago. In fact, I started reporting in the summer of 2022. And the reason why is because I thought these people and these different kind of intellectual strands in Silicon Valley were super interesting and poorly understood. Like my editors didn't really know what some of them knew what effective altruism was, but no one knew what progress studies was. It wasn't even clear there was a broader tech right beyond Peter Thiel and PayPal descendant mafia at the time. So yeah, it was sort of to explain to the world like what these movements were, who are the young people who are kind of propagating these ideas forward. With those specific people, there's sort of a backstory to this. It wasn't the original plan. Originally, we were like, okay, we have three intellectual strands: effective altruism, progress studies, tech right. Let's find one person for each of them. And at first, it was like, okay, SBF was super big at the time. Like, let's get him. But then we had profiled him pretty recently, so he was like, okay, that's off the table. And I was thinking about Dustin Moskovitz because of open philanthropy. And he actually declined to be interviewed. And also, he's not really that public. He started tweeting and then posts on Threads all the time now. He still doesn't do any interviews. So that didn't work. Vitalik, we had also profiled recently, and he's also not quite Silicon Valley. So ended up just being a hodgepodge of, three of the more perhaps most intellectually interesting people under the age of 40 in Silicon Valley. That was Sam, Patrick, and Joe. Paul was not really one of the three. He was supposed to sort of be the elder statesman, the kind of intellectual forefather. And we also kind of cast Peter Thiel in that role, though I didn't speak with him. I think I sort of slept on Elon in that piece. Knew he was super important, of course, but he didn't write that much publicly about his worldview. And he hadn't bought Twitter yet. So it was just less present in the discourse. And I also think that his net worth before COVID was like way smaller than it was after. Like Tesla ripped, which gave him way more leeway to do things than, he always had, his hands in a lot of buckets, but sort of force multiplied that. And I think we only really saw the effects of that in the past year and a half. And yeah, so I will say I didn't see that coming, and in general underestimated how big the shift was in the tech right direction. I do think there were people in the sort of capitalist class of Silicon Valley who were keeping quiet. Like I think Mark Andreessen probably was already quite red-pilled, maybe even before 2020. He was just very quiet about it. And then there was this sort of preference cascade, cast on scene style that happened over the course of the last year and a half, and you saw everyone come out.
Yeah, that makes sense. I definitely buy that. Like a lot of it was bottled up for a lot of folks, except like Peter Thiel and like a sort of select few who were loudly contrarian. One interesting choice there is you've told me that you think that Joe Lonsdale's influence is quite underrated. I think of our listenership, he might be the name that not everyone is like super familiar with. I was curious if you could say more about that.
Yeah, maybe just somewhat underrated. I think he puts his money where his mouth is in terms of actually doing institution building, which a lot of people don't, right? I think the University of Austin is the best example. Seems to be going off to a decent start. They have a really strong set of people. I think it's a cool thing that they're doing this, trying to create a new university. And he's also very connected to young people, up and coming people in Silicon Valley, because he kind of maintains his connections with the Stanford Review. 8VC recruits a lot of top people out of Stanford. He has a Cicero Institute, which does some interesting work on housing and homelessness and so forth. So I think it would be wrong to cast them as like the protege of Peter, which is maybe a thing I thought at one point, and now I think he's much less a philosopher and more of a pragmatist, but still an important person.
Yeah, that makes sense. What else did you change your mind on while you were reporting this piece?
I think that one of the key tensions, and I'm very curious what you think on this, is this something new, or is it just a rendition of the old, rich people having political and social influence? People lobby, even grand statements being philosophical, not new. In early 20th century, Andrew Carnegie wrote this essay, Gospel Wealth, basically like his promoting his philosophical moral worldview that rich people have a moral obligation to, and he kind of details what that means. Rockefeller had this great quote, competition is a sin. Sounds a lot like Peter Thiel's competition is for loser. George Soros had a PhD in philosophy. You could argue he and Bill Gates are sort of the leading people behind the kind of neoliberal philanthropy that was sort of dominant in the 90s and 2000s. It's just that was the establishment at the time. So now we're seeing a new wave and it's different. And so to us growing up, it feels unique. But then once you look to history, you realize that stuff constantly happens over and over again in every generation. Maybe one thing that distinguishes the current set of tech leaders is they try to build new institutions rather than working within existing ones. But the robber barons, early 20th century, were doing that too. They were building new universities, libraries, etc. So what is new? Well, I think you could make the case for a few things. One is just technology. Like internet means that all these people, like their reach is far greater than anyone before. You can't do what Elon's doing today without the internet or software. I think you just can't manage that many separate things at once. Like Rockefeller, who is the richest person before Elon in terms of wealth, was just Standard Oil, really. And the second, I think, is public writing. We talked about this a bit before, like using social media, using blog posts, podcasts to sort of influence the minds, influence the direction of technology. And Sam, I think, is the best example of this. He sort of tried to reorient YC in a more hard tech direction. You could questionable success, but certainly tried. You could write op-eds and papers before, but the internet probably that's a new thing, right? And I think that relates to the third thing that's new, which is just like VC fundraising dynamics and startup risk culture, where you're basically using finance to pull the future forward. And we never had so much risk capital as we do today. And I think that incentivizes this kind of worldview building, having a lofty vision, building hype, because you need to do that to recruit, to convince people to work for you rather than for FANG, and also get investors to invest in you. And sort of like a rational delusion type thing, right? In any individual case, it's probably not correct, but like it needs to happen for like the system to work.
So I wanted to talk a little bit more about progress studies, because this is the idea machine that I am currently most interested in and most intrigued by. I'm going to paraphrase the loose definition that I wrote in my tech right disambiguation post. Progress studies, as I see it, is sort of this rising alliance of thinkers, policymakers, and industrialists who are united by their focus on accelerating U.S. innovation, largely through science and technology, to drive U.S. economic growth and global primacy. I think it's interesting because it feels both nonpartisan and bipartisan. Like individual members who might affiliate themselves with Progress have a range of political beliefs. They might call themselves supply side progressives or EACs or American dynamists or abundance liberals. Some folks just seem like neolibs and neocons to me. They're just rebranding themselves. But like a lot of them are rallying around the same set of issues, like R&D funding, China competition, deregulating supply in domains like housing, energy, pharmaceuticals. And these folks seem to believe both in markets and market failures, both like the motivating magic of capitalism and the need for competent governance to speed up growth when it slows. And I also sort of suspect that a lot of the folks in this coalition, especially the newer people coming from tech, in their ideal world would prefer not to think about politics. And it was more sort of that they ran up against the constraints that politics imposed and were like, well, guess this is the bottleneck that we got to fix. The question I have for you, I guess, as another fellow progress studies watcher, is I'm curious where these folks came from. So, like, for example, like in 2019, there was this like big Atlantic op-ed co-authored by Patrick Collison and Tyler Cowen called "We Need a New Science of Progress," and that was obviously very influential. But like you sent me this like New Yorker profile on Sam Altman from 2016 when he was still president of YC, and at that point, Altman is already thinking very similarly about the role of science, hard tech, and defense in jumpstarting growth, and like the fact that growth is like so important to all of the society and political institutions that we hold dear. And I'm curious where you think Silicon Valley's interest in this like science-driven growth came from.
Yeah. One thought on broader progress coalition, then I'll
Mhm.
answer that, which is this in a way is kind of predictable given the macroeconomic context of inflation. Also with China, so Mark Zachary Taylor, he's a political scientist at Georgia Tech, has a good book called The Politics of Innovation, which basically shows that when countries face security threats, they invest a lot more in R&D. And that involves deregulating to make sure that R&D goes a long way. There's the 70s example, there's the World War II example, investing in creating all the entire national science funding apparatus and so forth. So I think what I'm very curious about, I don't have an answer to is what ways do the particular ideologies of today's kind of tech elite, how does it change how that instantiates compared to what would have happened if maybe we had a different set of characters in charge. On science-driven growth in particular, the other sort of backdrop to this is the recognition within the tech industry that the internet and software, while they made people a lot of money, its broader impact on living standards, on growth, maybe wasn't as high. Peter Thiel's, we've seen change in bits, but not atoms. Tyler Cowen's great stagnation. And I think it's also a realization that, there is an end to every tech cycle. And so what's the next thing? And you make a lot of money from identifying the next thing. And then maybe the third thing is tech really is ideological. People do want to do the coolest thing that really does change how the world works. And I think Sam is certainly oriented in that direction. So there has been a cultural shift where deeper tech has become cooler, harder problems. And yeah, that's probably, a big factor behind this interest in science-driven growth. I think it's, also, if you want to be a great man, working on science is like cooler, right? It's like you have deep intelligence as opposed to just good at business optimization. So I think there's a bit of that too.
Yeah, that's useful contextualization. There's this Sam quote in that New Yorker profile where he says that democracy only works in a growing economy. Without a return to economic growth, the democratic experiment will fail. Do you agree with this?
In a way, yes. Like, growth masks all problems, but the response is also like economist Dietrich Wohlrath has a book called Fully Grown, which is basically as the country gets richer, it starts to prioritize other things other than consumption of, tangible goods. So look at Western Europe. I know it's fashionable right now to shit on European growth, but actually, I think if you do the proper PPP adjustments, you look at overall welfare, including things like life expectancy, public amenities, I think quality of life is higher than in a lot of Western European cities in the US. Like I preferred London over basically any American city. I'm here for other reasons, which is like the people. But so I think that narrative is a little bit overblown. Western Europe is less polarized than America, arguably at less risk of democratic backsliding. So lower growth, more politically stable. So I think that's like a straight test of that argument. And maybe we're in sort of a post-material world where it's less true than it used to be. That said, like it does help to grow. It does reduce tension. So maybe it's also a cultural thing where in America we come to expect rising living standards, where in terms of consumption, but in Western Europe, people sort of know the trade-off they're making.
Yeah, I was curious if you could elaborate the Steelman for the argument that democracy only does work and when you have high growth. Like, why is that true?
Well, why would it be true?
Yeah.
It's sort of like the debate that's happening in India right now, where people are like, hey, we should be more like China and grow faster because we're poor.
And notably, China not growing very fast, democratic backsliding.
No longer. But like, if there is this trade-off, then when you're poor, you might deprioritize democracy and procedure and fairness and all this stuff because people when they're poor do want to get rich. But I don't think we have enough of a sense of the preferences of already developed countries and political stability within them. Is there a cross-country relationship between, oh, you have a slowdown in growth and you become less democratic? I mean, the recent experience suggests that's the case across the world, but there are lots of other changes too, like media environment, and the vibes just change, as Tyler Cowen would say. There's not necessarily like a causal explanation for it.
Yeah. I don't know very much about economics, which is why I was sort of like curious if there was, good literature on this question, which I'm sure there are.
There is stuff on like, deindustrial, like one of my professors at MIT, David Otter, has work on areas of America that were affected by Chinese import competition after they joined the WTO in 2001. Lots of manufacturing job loss, has big local multiplier effects, and predicts rightward shifts. Also lots of other negative impacts in communities. So that's certainly true.
The thing that's interesting to me about some of this like growth philosophy stuff is there's like part of me that wants to say the assumption that growth will gloss over political questions is naive, because let's say you want to deregulate. Where will you deregulate first? You want to build more housing. Where will housing get built and not get built? And like sometimes there is so many resources. And so those prioritization questions do reflect political trade-offs. At the same time, I'm also like, the best case for abundance to me theoretically is like growth unlocks choice. A diverse society has lots of inherently irreconcilable and irresolvable values. Like some people want to live here and some people want to live there. And like you can get in like endless debates and community input meetings about where to build the buildings. But like in the end, the only way to resolve these differences in a diverse society is like have enough total choices that everybody can have a little bit of what they want. And all we can do is create a more positive sum environment. Like I guess like again, I'm thinking about San Francisco again because I'm just like trying to learn a little bit more about politics here. And it does feel like so much of the antagonism against tech, even against things like YIMBYism, is because there isn't enough space in housing here, which means that it feels like when tech comes in, there is just like this like brutal trade-off of like creatives and service workers and everybody else have to move out. And it does make me think like, yeah, if we had more total housing, if everything was more affordable, etc., then I don't know if there would be that kind of antagonism, because the antagonism comes from like the zero-sum nature of like who gets to live in the city, when in fact, like I think in a place like New York, which is denser and there's like just more space and more neighborhoods, there's a very complementary synergistic relationship between being a financial capital, being a cultural capital, and like being a place where a lot of working class folks can like make a true living. And like SF, by its constraint of space, it's so zero sum. It's just like, if these people move in, we got to move out. And like that just like escalates the tension so much.
I totally agree with that. I guess I would just say that feels a little bit less like growth and more like how much scarce resources you have relative to how unequal purchasing power is. Like, but in a way, growth caused this problem is like the bad way to frame this, because you had growth without massive growth of the tech industry in this region clustered without corresponding growth in the housing supplies. You had a huge increase in inequality without an expansion of the scarce resource. So that created the problem. Now, yeah, obviously we should build housing. But then if you were to look at other cities that are at a lower level of per capita GDP, they might not have the same problem if you have less inequality relative to the scarce resource. So it's like growth alone doesn't solve the problem. You need the scarce resource to sort of expand enough to cover up how much inequality you have in consumption. I'm very sympathetic to the Progress Coalition. You could even say I'm part of it in many ways, but in the 2010s, it was fashionable to talk about inequality. Now it's fashionable to talk about growth. We're going to probably be talking about inequality again in a decade or two.
Yeah. Yeah, actually, that's a really useful clarification, because I realized I had sort of conflated like GDP growth with simultaneous increase in the amount of resources and infrastructure. Part of the problem in the Bay Area, like you said, is that we got a lot of GDP growth, but the physical infrastructure, governmental infrastructure, everything else is like not kept up with that.
Yeah.
That makes a lot of sense. I do associate you as like broadly within the Progress Coalition, which I also am like somewhat sympathetic to, but I don't know if I'd consider myself a part of. I'm curious, like as both an observer and a member, is there anything that you think the Progress folks miss?
Generally, I think a big fan. I also think there is quite a big diversity of viewpoints, as you mentioned earlier. I think possibly intellectually, the main thing I would say is there's probably a big emphasis on innovation, and less of an emphasis on diffusion of technology. So Jeffrey Ding, who's at George Washington, has some cool work comparing America and China in terms of technological capabilities. And his basic point is that on measures of innovation and where you're at the frontier, like the difference between US and China is actually not that big. Like on a lot of sectors, 5G and electric vehicles, batteries, there are lots of ways in which China is actually probably ahead of America now, manufacturing being the number one thing. But then on diffusion of technology, that's why US's national power is much greater, why living standards are higher, because if you were to go to a second or third tier city, like America does much better in terms of adoption of computers and allocation of resources. And the economic way of putting it is there's much less misallocation. And the intensity of use of your technology is much greater. And, if you want to achieve that UK is suffering from this right now, where in many ways, like they're at the frontier of biotech and AI, but besides London, they have pretty poor tech diffusion. You need very standard things that are maybe less sexy. You need good human capital for people to adopt technology. You need competitive markets so you churn out the bad firms and the good ones scale. And this means you should care about education, antitrust, which is, I would say, are not the top issues in the progress studies world. I think they would probably say, or what I would say if someone told me this is like, yeah, but other people are focusing on this, which is true. So we're focusing on the things that are less emphasized, but I've not done the analysis in terms of where the marginal impact is actually going to be greatest.
So are you saying when you talk about diffusion, are you saying like how well the median city is doing or how well the like 25th or 75th percentile is doing? Because I do think that tech, for example, likes to focus on the top, the 99th percentile.
Yeah, I think that's exactly it. I mean, this is one of the failure modes of India, and also actually America was great in expanding public education early in its history, which Europe did less of. And that matters a lot because if you're second and third tier cities, your 25th percentile, 50th percentile person can adopt technologies. That's what is going to lift your overall living standard and growth rate.
Yeah. It's interesting to think about like from a political rhetoric and comms perspective, like how do we develop the ways to talk about that? Because I do think it's so easy to like all higher education discussions are about Harvard and Stanford. All technology discussions are about what happens in San Francisco. Like there is just sort of an ease and a bias to like only focus on the leading edge of things, and it can mask a lot of problems. Like the US can talk about the Fortune 500 is doing great, and then like everyone is like, no, but like the economy feels like shit to me personally because like the stats that you're looking at, are too aggregate or like only reflect the leading edge or something like that.
Yeah. The mainstream does think a lot about the sort of, the left behind regions and geographic inequality and so forth. So maybe there's like a good division of labor here, right? Silicon Valley is the innovation engine. And then it depends on how powerful the Progress Coalition gets, right? If they're like, they become the government, then they have to care about the other stuff too. But if they're still thinking on the margin, then maybe it's...
Yeah, I mean, even the anti-woke cultural side of things does seem to be like a lot of folks in tech and believe that we have become too focused on bringing up the tail end and not sufficiently focused on ensuring that we're like continuing to make progress at the leading edge. And how can we prevent tall poppy syndrome or something where we no longer want people to make lots of money and make giant companies and experiment with things? I did want to briefly touch upon our good friends EA, effective altruism. From when we were undergrads until probably the fall of SVF, I feel like this was clearly the biggest and most influential idea machine on the scene. They obviously have had a lot of impact. They were very, very early to shaping concerns around AI and AI safety. Like even policy impact wise, like the Biden executive order on AI was like extremely shaped by folks who have background in EA. But because largely of SVF, like it feels like it's lost a lot of credibility and influence in the public imagination. I'm also like, I think part of this is maybe with AI in particular, like a more competitive environment where like I'm not really sure personally like what the future of like safety is, because it feels like everyone right now, whether because of China or because of like intra-firm competition, is only interested in accelerating, and the appetite for like a pause or a slowdown seems less likely now. I actually feel quite bad for EA because I've been a critic in the past, but I am like, wow, a lot of these people are actually like, doing a lot of really rigorous research and making real sacrifices to do good things for the world. And now I feel like selfishness is kind of in vogue and they keep getting clowned on for like trying to do good things.
Yeah.
But yeah, I'm just like curious, like, what do you think happens to EA from here on out? Like, do you think they're up, down? Do you think that they are still as influential as they were? What's going on?
Yeah, it's kind of weird because you're absolutely right that in terms of status, they are down. I mean, SBF, a lot of the AI safety stuff getting kind of memed on now, but in terms of influence, you could argue that they're more powerful than ever. They're, they've been right about a lot of things that other people were sleeping on. In a way, when you become mainstream and other people start thinking through the frameworks that you had offered, your individual people might be less influential, but your ideas had a big impact. I think that's sort of where EA is at. I think some things have been institutionalized, like the UK AI Safety Institute. I think the way they're doing things actually makes a lot of sense, right? What is it? Constant vigilance on the frontiers. So they monitor frontier models for dangerous capabilities. They have a lot of really talented people who in 5 or 10 years ago would not have otherwise worked in government, particularly from the tech industry. Like you got Paul Cristiano, who could be like founding an AI company and raising a bunch of money right now. Yes, we are in huge acceleration mode, but again, everything's at the margin, right? Like that's because we've learned that the fast takeoff scenarios are not likely to happen, whatever people say about drop-in remote workers. And there's huge uncertainty around what the first 18 months of Trump will look like. And there's some uncertainty over where AI progress will go. Maybe if there's like some warning shot with AI progress and some bad stuff happens, whatever it is, then you could see a return. Sam Altman talks about this co-evolution idea, right? Like you want iterative deployment in a way that's also justification for them to do whatever they want in terms of rolling out the product. But I think it's relatively correct, right? You do want that to happen, and that's what's happening. People are adjusting and adapting, and that's good.
Yeah. I feel like I would probably buy the status dip on EA right now.
Oh yeah?
Yeah, I think I would.
What time? When will they come back?
Ooh, in a few years, maybe
Ooh.
like three years out. I think people got to get over the SBF thing, and another big prediction has to come true. Something they've been on that the rest of the world hasn't. We could see it. We could see it come back.
Maybe agents doing something bad.
Yeah, like I'm sort of like thinking in the like AI incidents world. When I was doing this project on public AI with our friend Nick Murda, this was with Mozilla, and we were sort of interested in how could we get more public federal investment in shared AI resources, compute data sets, things like that. And we were also trying to think about like how do we message the importance of AI to a more policy and a less tuned in technical audience. And so we were looking for historical analogies. And one of the ones that we turned to is transportation infrastructure, thinking about like highways and stuff like that. And one of the reasons for that was when cars were invented and trains and buses were invented, there was actually all these safety debates that were happening, and tons of people die in crashes, and there's tons of pollution. And then eventually you get seatbelts, you get speed limits, you get like clean air stuff to help mitigate the side effects. And it is this like decades long process to figure out how society can adapt to the influx of cars on the road, which was a real boon for a bunch of economic and freedom reasons. And so
didn't OpenAI, they had a paper recently.
Oh, the one that just came out?
Yeah.
I didn't read it yet.
Yeah, they refer to cars. They talk about the history of cars.
Oh man, really?
Yeah. I don't think they get into the social response, but they use it as an example of, hey, the horses got out of the way, the people got out of the way, and we rebuilt our infrastructure to make way for cars. But there's sort of assumption that was a good thing, but there's also like this whole strain of thinking that we've overbuilt American cities.
But totally.
That's one of the reasons why I love London. So I think it's like a really bad example for hey, let's go headstrong and re-engineer society for a new technology. Even though I am generally in the like, let's go full steam ahead with AI, but the cars thing did not quite make sense to me.
That's funny. Yeah, it was one of those things where Nick and I like put this in our policy doc about it, and there's one paragraph about AI and cars and transportation, but then the number of comments that we got from reviewers relative to like how much space it took up, with people arguing about the value of cars and like highway history and train history. Like, man, people get into that stuff. Our argument, for what it's worth, was that we were actually like, just as there are private cars and we perhaps overcorrected on private cars, it's really important that we have public alternatives in AI. And so just as you have these like private consumer apps, like maybe those are the cars, what does the public bus or high-speed rail of AI look like? But the thing I was sort of getting at there was when you look at safety questions around the adoption of cars, like a lot of people basically had to die first. Like there was like so many crashes and pollution got so bad that big advocacy organizations of concerned parents and environmentalists who were like our kids are dying on the road, and like, let's go to Congress and lobby for these safety laws. And like, part of me basically wonders, I think that AI safety will make a comeback when there is a sufficiently high profile, extremely obvious harms. Like, not to say that folks haven't died as a result of AI systems before. Like, I think that has already happened in various ways, but like, I
Oh,
feel
really?
like there's, well, I mean, you know, like, there there are autonomous weapons that like sometimes kill civilians, right? Like, there are AI systems that will make mistakes that will lead to people dying. And so like,
Are they
there's an
autonomous though? Like the drones in Ukraine? Maybe they're autonomous. I don't know.
at least in like
Drone.
a lot of Israel's
Yeah.
targeting is AI.
Okay.
There's
Yeah.
like a 972 article that I can link about it. But these are automated decision making systems. They get integrated into lots of things. Like, if that system is one that has the power to like let someone live or die, like, there are probably going to be mistakes made. You can argue about whether it's more or less mistakes than a human would have made, right? Like, I think that's a very valid argument to have, but like, certainly, depending on your definition, people have died because of AI. There's like an AI incidents database that I can look up with sort of like a list of examples I think some EA folks made and have been keeping up. But yeah, like, the question to me is like, clearly none of these have like risen to the level of like really getting like the AI safety movement like back in. And I'm like a little bit nervous about like, what is the incident that will get people to go like, oh shit, regulations, slow down.
Yeah. No, it's a good question. And then there's a whole entire other strand of EA that's not AI that's sort of humming along. And um, there's a lot of development people who are very EA influenced, and there's a whole debate around did we go too far with randomized controlled trials, and now Open Philanthropy is starting this team to invest in projects focused on growth promotion in developing countries, which I think is really good. They've made a massive mark on that whole world, funding huge amounts of research and philanthropy and stuff, and it's just less in the news.
I know less about the world, but also, yeah, it seems less controversial overall. I feel like I'm probably a fan. Like, you should probably test the efficacy of things you do. I like donate to the charities once a year when everyone does their like big give directly
Yeah.
promotions. Yeah, cool. Okay, I feel like we could very easily talk about all these things for a very long time, but coming up on our allotted time, and so we will, I'm sure, to return to things like what's up with the big AI infrastructure paper that OpenAI did, and what's up with EA in the future. I actually do really need to read that paper. But I guess my final question for you is just like, what is a research question that you personally are trying to untangle right now?
Yeah. I guess one that's sort of on theme for this podcast is on thinking about AI capabilities. And the term artificial intelligence is sort of a strange term, because are we really building intelligence like we understand it for humans? And so far, I don't think that's what we're building. We're building something that's much more uneven, and it's already superhuman at many things that humans are bad at, and it's much worse than us at other things. And some people use the term jagged frontier. A friend of mine, Basil, likes the term multidimensional intelligence. And so, we're trying to think about how to model this explicitly and create a framework for thinking about what are the different dimensions. Is progress going faster in some than others? What are the implications for the economy in terms of impacts on labor markets, on employment, growth, et cetera? And just a thought is, I think probably that's better if it's multidimensional. The frontier is kind of jagged versus perfectly matches the human frontier, because then it just essentially preserves a human advantage in some domains. And then you get like nice gains from trade. If you had something that was like strictly the same as a human, but like just zero cost, you'd probably add more bad negative labor market impacts, and you can still get a lot of growth. In fact, you get the most growth from things that are good at things that humans are not good at, creating new tasks, new industries, and so forth. So yeah.
Yeah, whoa. I'd never thought about it as gains from trade, but like, that totally does make sense, actually.
Yeah. Like there are a lot of econ people who think the pursuit of human-like AI, that's the wrong goal. And I think there's something valid to that point, which is the biggest gains come from when we don't just automate existing tasks, but we do entirely new things. And that might happen with this kind of jagged intelligence-like concept.
Okay, we should talk more about what AI and AGI means and the jagged frontier thing at some point, which will not be the next hour. But
Sounds good.
cool. Thanks so much for doing this with me. This is
It was a
fun.
lot of fun. I really enjoyed it.
Hey, this is Jasmine again, a little bit later, several hours later after I'm done editing the whole thing. Thank you so much for listening to the first episode of my podcast. You can find the essays and the links for this at jasmine.substack.com. And because this is the first episode, I am very keen to hear your feedback. Like, was the format good? Was the audio quality all right? Do you look at the video? And I'm hoping basically to bring in a new smart friend to talk about whatever it is I've been writing and thinking about that week to provide some extra context and knowledge that I myself don't have. So if you like it, please let me know. Please send it to people. Really appreciate you listening. jasmine.substack.com.